Mm-hmm. Hi, Leslie. Good morning for me and midday for you.
Hi, good morning.
How are you doing today?
I am doing great. Excited to be talking about one of my favorite nerdy topics.
Modeling specifically or Power BI in general?
Both, but data modeling and performance optimization and building things in a way that they're going to be flexible, scalable, and all of that jazz. Yeah.
Anything that allows it just to become those universal principles that can be applied.
Yeah, 100%.
Now, considering I've had her on the live stream before, can I get a quick shout out as well for the shirt that you're wearing for that
Oh
from
yeah.
Carrie Kalasko?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Shut
shut up
up
and
and
dax
Dax
with
with
me.
me.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. She did the artwork for that too. I think. Yeah,
Yeah, she did. She's got a couple good ones. There's another one that Dax the Night Away that I've got. The very
that's pretty
beleaguered
fun.
person late at night continuing to work on their decks. It's good.
You know, funny enough, the second company that I started earlier this year with Steve Campbell, Analytic Endeavors, the new logo that I'm using now, she actually developed.
Yeah,
So she's a really good graphic artist for sure.
yeah, very talented.
But I'm excited to get you on to the stream for the first time. So one thing that I like to do with new streamers is give them a chance to introduce themselves to the channel and give a little background on themselves. If you'd
Yeah,
like to provide some context.
absolutely. And thank you. Yeah, so
Yeah.
my name is Leslie Welch. I am the Principal Fellow of AI and Analytics at Excella. We're an agile tech consulting firm just outside of DC in Arlington, Virginia. And I have been working with Power BI since it came out of the Excel closet in 2015. So this is definitely an area of depth and passion for me for almost 10 years now. So quite a long time.
Yeah, it's were you using this stuff as far back as like when we still had Power View and all that in Excel?
No, it was literally like I think a month after it came out as its own application, and I did not know
Hmm.
it was as new. But I was working for a company that was doing a lot of Excel reporting, and their clients wanted interactive visualization, and it was also my intro to data visualization development as a career field. So I started doing a lot of research on different tools out there, and I tested some out and determined that that one was most suited for what we were trying to do. And then found out a few months later that I just like jumped in right after it came out. So been there almost
So
since the beginning.
right place, right time kind of
Yeah,
situation.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Excellent. And on top of the front end with the visualization aspect of everything, and we also have like the topic of today, which is kind of focused on backend and modeling. Uh, where would you like to get started on like what we'll be covering in terms of the
Yeah.
topic or the things and all
Yeah.
that?
I actually have a slide with that information. So I
Oh,
always
sure.
like to kind of level set and share with folks what exactly that we're going to be covering. So um, I will kind of move through quickly here, just a little bit of a um, bird's eye view of my interests. I do have a couple of interests that aren't data related, but I'm not going to say I'm not collecting data on those things when I'm doing them. Um, and like I said, I've been doing this for quite a while. Another thing that I want to mention is, along with Lenore Flower, I am the co-organizer of Power BI DC. We meet every month in person in Arlington. Be meeting next week. I'll give some link at the end for anyone who's in the DC area and would like to come check it out. And today we are talking about this concept of planning your semantic model for better performance, better ability to build the kinds of visuals that you need to build. And so there's a couple of things that we need to have like a good mental model before we start planning out what that semantic model is going to look like. So we're going to look at some performance considerations. So we have a good picture of like generally what kind of end state we're looking for. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we approach requirements gathering and how a wireframe fits into your model planning. And then how do we actually build out that schema, that star schema that we are looking for when our data is coming from a very different format. So before we jump into that, usually when I do this talk for a live audience, I like to start it out with some put a finger down. So I'm going to put you on the spot, Reed, and
Yes,
ask you a couple of questions and tell me which
please.
one of these you've experienced early on or even recently. So first of all, there's like when you're putting fields or measures into a table visual, and you see the same value for every row. So that's your first put a finger down if.
Oh, if I've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
Let me make sure it's okay. Then yeah, you
Or
can.
if you've ever experienced a model crashing or had enough time to go make a cup of coffee while you were waiting for a Power Query step to load.
Definitely waited the Power Query. A quick definition on what would a model crashing look like? I can definitely understand the Power Query
Where
one, but I'm
Power
curious the
BI
other.
desktop actually like shuts
Oh yeah,
down.
okay. Yep.
Yeah.
When we did the Web
Um,
2.0 migration, there's a lot of that.
Yep. And how about opening up someone else's model and you had no idea what was going on? And maybe even that someone was like you 6 months ago.
Yep.
And then final two more, I guess. If you built a model or report only to find out that something in the requirements or your understanding of it was wrong, and you had some major model redesign work in order to be able to fill those requirements.
Yep.
And then finally, if you've ever spent so much time staring at this loading image that it started to feel like staring at this image is perhaps most of what your job actually is.
I have anthropomorphized this thing.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that word is slightly off, but I don't know if you're ever played games when you're growing up, but Navi from the Zelda series. In my
Mm-hmm.
head, this is the little Navi fairy, and like she's just chasing herself around because I need something to kill the boredom. So I just consider this like a little fairy spirit that's just having a good time, just chasing its own tail.
Yeah, I sometimes staring at that, like I'm picturing that meme in my head where this is the what I actually do after all the like what my friends
Yeah.
think I do, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of reasons those things can happen. But like at the heart of all of that is what's going on with your model. And so this is a screenshot with the actual tables blurred to protect the innocent. But this is a model that I got pulled in to help with because it was crashing on many people's laptops and they were just trying to figure out how to untangle things so they could work on it. If you recognize this view, it's in Power Query in desktop. You can look at a view of like how the tables are connected, and I found a lot of interesting things in there, including multiple connections to the same source from different places. But I also found things like there's 3 developers working on this, and at one point there was a query that had referenced a query. They made some changes and then they added that same query, like appended it, and that was not intentional. This stuff was happening because there was just so much going on. People weren't really thinking about like what they were trying to do in terms of like what's the concept of the model. They were just like, we need this additional data, and they just kept piecemealing stuff. And pretty soon it got to the point that like we can't do this anymore, and we have to fix it. And like beyond how does the model work on the back end, how do I understand it, there's this challenge you run into pretty often where the DAX isn't working the way that it ought to work. Can't figure out why it's not working that way. People usually want to start by like, let's go and debug the DAX here. But I'd like to start with the model so we can understand what the tables are, the relationships. So oftentimes like the source of your DAX issues are there. And the source of like pain points for many, many Power BI developers is why is DAX so hard? And I would like to pose to you that with proper like forethought and design of your model, you can actually get to a point where you feel like I know what I'm doing. And in most scenarios, I can get right to the kind of DAX that I need, and it's a lot less complex. So jumping into the performance considerations, so we know what our aim is for. I do want to call out one thing, which is like, this is my maybe one of my biggest beefs with Microsoft. There's a default setting in Power BI Desktop that has a pretty big impact on your performance. Personally, I wish that when you're installing it, maybe you have the option and they explain it. Guy in a Cube has suggested that this is about like, could increase the size of your model by like 60%. I've seen like around 52% in some scenarios. And what it is the auto date time in desktop creates these local date tables hidden in the background for every single date or date time field that you have in your report. So if you're trying to work on like, let me do some model cleanup and stuff, this is one thing that you're going to want to start with if you haven't done it. If you've done it at a global level recently, you're going to want to look at previous semantic models that you've built and make sure that you handle it on the current file level. And I would also say, I don't know if it was like last month's release or the month before, but there was recently a desktop release that turned it back on by default. So we found like a whole slew of recent things that we're back in that scenario of having those. So you may also want to look, just double check if you have a recent update to make sure that that's still up. And then also thinking about like overall, what is the schema design that we're looking for? So you hear a lot of people talk about how you need to get to a star schema, don't want a snowflake. This is true for a lot of reasons. And when we're thinking about like how that schema is built, it's really about like that one directional relationship between our dimension and our fact. And we really want to not have like all of these hops to get from what we're trying to filter to the fact table. And then I have a very short clip that I want to share because I cannot say this better myself. This is my sort of automatic response 29-second YouTube clip that I share with folks when they're like, yes, but I would love to have a star schema, but with my data, it's actually better for me not to do that. And so I'm just going to play this short thing and let you all see what you think of it.
So might not actually. I swear the sound was working earlier, but now it doesn't seem to actually be working. I swear we did test this though. Interesting.
Okay, sorry, you said the sound is not coming through.
If you can go back, is there? When you hover, you can see if there's the speakers muted on the toolbar.
It is not. Are you hearing it?
It might have been yeah, because the screen was shared and then we had to stop sharing and then shared it again. So it might have just been that we forgot to click the sound back on.
All good. I can move past it. At the end of
What
the day,
would you
the
paraphrase?
point is,
Yeah, exactly.
Alberta Ferrari has an awesome video about a more normalized traditional model and a star schema, and he's basically posing the question of like, is a more normalized model helpful? And he's just very persistently, no, it is not. I can already tell you. What, are you kidding me? No, never, never, never. So I just like how he makes no bones about it. It's always a better option for Power BI. And so this whole process that we're talking about today is like, how do we get to that when the things that we have don't obviously provide support for that? And it's a much longer video that clip comes from. That's really interesting if you really kind of want to dive into why this is true and how do you get there.
As a quick thing to that is the term that I like to coin to kind of describe to customers is it's pretty rare you can ever get perfect star. You're going to usually get close. It's a goal you aim for, but you're never going to actually get there, like outside of an AdventureWorks data set. So I like the term that I like is starflake. So instead of because you're a little hybrid of both. At some point you'll end up with some many-to-many where you need a bridge table or something else just because your data cannot be collapsed into a single dimension. So starflake I feel is a nice term for a hybrid of the two of them. It's a little bit of both, as more star than flake, but there's going to be a little flakiness to the model that's in there.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And so the way that we think about it is, how do we get as close to a star schema as possible, with our goal being like, we want to make this a star schema. And when we come across something that we can't quite get there, then that's where we look into assumptions. But like starting with the assumption that we're going to get it very close is really what we want to do. And you kind of jumped right into the heart of thinking about relationships when you're planning your model, which is that like at the end of the day, what we're aiming for here are one directional relationships between the dimension to the fact with the dimension filtering the fact. But as you mentioned, like 15 seconds before I was going to jump into it, there's a challenge there, because like, what if you've got many-to-many relationships, like a lot of them? This is the world that I live in. I'm working with federal hiring data, and there seems like it's almost like there's less scenarios where you've got a one-to-many than a many-to-many with the data that we're looking for. And this is really challenging because we've got both an enormous amount of data and a pretty high user base. So there's like all of these competing factors that really make it so getting to that performance is super, super important. So I was kind of struggling with this because I don't like taking it's impossible for an answer. So I went on to one Saturday, I went on to the Guy in a Cube live stream, and Matthew Roche was on there that day, and I explained to them, like, here's the situation that I'm in. I've got scenarios, I've got like 8, 10, 12 dimensions that are many to many with fact tables that have many, many millions of records in them. And I'm just trying to figure out, like, there's got to be a better way for what we're doing. We talked through the different scenarios, and they were pretty, like, hands down. Well, first of all, they were like, that's very sad, and you should probably see if you can change something about how the data works. But in lieu of convincing the federal government to change their hiring process, we talked about what's the best approach for these things. And so the approach that we use for all of those many-to-many relationships is we create this list ID that every list ID represents a unique pairing of all of the potential options. And so it's not a traditional bridge table, it's just a single record bridge table. And that list ID gives us, here's the combination of things that we need to our fact. In some scenarios, this actually existed in the data source, but most of them it did not. There is a super cool SQL function called CRC32 that can actually take, you can do like a concatenation of the IDs associated, maybe throw some array around it. So you can get like all in the same order, and it will convert that to like a hash value and get you to a new ID associated with that list, which is really cool because it doesn't require you to merge anything to get a list ID in different places that have the same data. So that's our approach to handling that one. And when we do that, of course, like the natural direction is going to be the bridge filtering both. So we just make that dimension to bridge bidirectional, much smaller groups of data than having that bidirectional relationship with the fact, and incredible impact on our performance.
So quick question on this, and
yeah,
it's something that I think a lot of people don't understand is, and maybe you're getting this. So do you talk about a direct many to many path? If you have this coming up, I'll pause for that. But otherwise, I'd be curious of your considerations on why not get rid of the bridge table, just do a direct many to many, choose your direction, and since we had that added, what, 2.5, 3 years ago?
The direct many to many with like 10 dimensions and the fact table.
Yeah, but because again, I think a lot of people don't understand the implications of certain types of relationships. There are some extra performance considerations on a true many to many, where you could technically just eliminate this bridge table, connect these two tables together, and it does go to the same path, but it might perform differently.
Yes, it performs a lot worse, and sometimes you get results you're not really expecting. And then when you're adding in like that sheer volume of many to many relationships, it just becomes totally untenable, especially with large amounts of data. So I would never encourage anyone to do a many to many relationship with a fact table. And also the things that I'm talking about here in terms of performance, we are focused on every single opportunity we have to optimize performance, because there's some things that are out of our control, like the number of scenarios like this, or the way that some things may have like data suppression in the DAX alongside row level security. And so as you add all of these complicating factors, it affects the performance. And so we're looking for everything we have control over to make that as good as it can, because some of these things we just can't really change because just what is in the data.
Agreed. I'll just briefly paraphrase it. To keep it simple, is there's essentially strong and weak relationships that can be in the model. One to minis, and even one to many that's bidirectional, those are still all strong relationships with defined kind of mappings row by row. A direct many to many is basically a weaker relationship, and it does not scale well. So on a small model, if you have one dimensional table and like to one fact table that just needs a many to many, sure, on a couple million rows, it's not much of a problem. But if you have a large enterprise model, this at hundreds of millions and billions of rows will perform exponentially faster than a direct many-to-many. But that,
Yeah.
unfortunately, is not an apparent thing. They trumpeted that as kind of a bit of a replacement of this, but it just doesn't scale nearly as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It does not scale. And I think I have definitely become a better modeler when dealing with scale on both the volume of data and also like the complexity of data and the number of users. You add all those factors in, and it just, you really have to start at, there's like maybe 10 ways to do things if you've got a small data set, and it narrows down
Yeah,
to like maybe two, and one of them is slow once you're dealing with large amounts of data.
exactly.
And then another thing that often people are reluctant to truly take to heart is like, don't have stuff in your model that you're not using, but you might use someday. So we kind of break down our categories of how we're bringing in what we need. So first of all, anything that's used in a visual or a slicer, which is also a visual, but sometimes forgotten on that list. We always have those loaded and visible. If they are used in relationships or DAX measures only, we actually go ahead and hide those from the semantic model, because we are also enabling end users to take thin reports and modify them for their use. So we really want to keep that like as simple as possible so that folks can work with the model without getting as confused about all of these things that we have underneath. And then we want to make our transformations in the data source when possible, but sometimes it's not possible because you're just not able to get someone to give you access or to do the thing that you need. So if you're making those calculations in Power Query, take them out as soon as you're done with those columns so that you're not loading all that to the front end. And then like if you're not using it, bring it in later when you need it. Sometimes you don't have control over that view, but at the very least you can narrow down that data as early as possible so that you're not working through things that don't need to be evaluated or a larger model than you need.
There's one trick that Chris Webb mentioned on getting rid of columns that it was a blog post from 6-7 years ago, but the choose column
Mm-hmm.
step, even if that
Oh
table
yeah,
has 100% of the columns you want today,
yeah,
add that at the end, selecting all of the columns that exist, because it hard codes those columns
yeah,
in the query. So then if a new column just pops up in the future, it does not show up in
yeah,
your model. So I
yeah.
do that as a standard practice in everything. One of the final
Same.
steps somewhere in your list should be a select column option, so you don't
Yeah,
accidentally grow your model size.
exactly. Keep it explicit, because this also helps us out, because all the Power Query stuff we're actually doing in data flows, but those data flows may expand for other semantic models in the future. And so that explicit selection of what we're using is something that we are always really cognizant of, because you don't know what's going to come up down the line. Um,
Exactly.
and then, of course, that record level transformation. And as John mentioned, yeah, this is Roche's maxim. We want to push things up to the source whenever we can. And if we can't push it up to the source, then, or you're talking about something like an aggregation that is at the record level, like do that in Power Query before you do it in DAX. Power Query is only running when you refresh. DAX is running every time somebody interacts with something that DAX measure touches. So trying to reduce the amount of impact on the end user when they're interacting with the report. And then the last little section before we jump into like, how do we get to requirements, is just talking about like thinking about your data types for performance. So these are the kind of guiding principles that we use. If it's a date and time, convert it to date. Date time has a really high cardinality. The dictionary size of your model gets a lot bigger. And actually, like if you need to do any analysis on time, it is much, much simpler to do that analysis if you're looking at time of day, if you have them split as date and time. So that one's kind of a no-brainer for us because of how many date-related things we have and how much of an impact that has on the size of the model. We also use integer dates. I did recently get some pushback on this on the Power BI subreddit recently, where someone was telling me that the integer and date values are, because of the way that it functions, that they're not any bigger or less performant. I do see in Tabular Editor that the size of that dictionary does get or the total size, like it gets bigger when they're date fields. I want to do some testing with like some high volumes. I don't know if it's a huge difference, but again, we're in a scenario where we're trying to, across the board, be as optimize our efficiency as much as possible. And our source data has everything in this form anyway. So our focus is on those relationship fields being integers, and we use a date table for all of the various date forms that we need. And then, like I said, we're looking for ID fields to be integers. There's a lot of scenarios where initially we had to use some kind of text value to figure out unique records because we're coming from like different sources with the same format. And so the IDs weren't unique. That goes back to that CRC32 function, so we can get to really performant relationships with a better data type. And then the last one, which I know is like a bit, I get more pushback on this, I think, than anything else when it comes to thinking about like our data source and types, which is like, if you've got a yes or no value or a 1 or 0, converting that to a logical value or Boolean value, so you've got just true or false, it's a more efficient data type. But like generally the pushback I get is like, doesn't that make your DAX worse? And I would argue, in fact, that if we can go in and look at how we're writing DAX, does this make it better or worse? When we are evaluating all of these different kinds of values, we've got a step in that DAX measure that is converting any of those values to true or false. So if we have already converted it to true or false, we automatically have answered that, and we're just calculating on the result of that particular value. Obviously, this does not make a good source for like a slicer, but that is easily handled by a very small dimension table that's connected on that true false value. And then we can do something that's like more user friendly. So instead of, in this example, having like a slicer that says paid account ? Yes, no, we can just have a account type, and then the results can say paid license, unpaid license, something like that.
I didn't realize there was as much of an implication for the actual evaluations. I feel like I should have known this, but
if you
yeah. Well, it makes sense
you
from
run it on a lot of
the
data,
language. Yeah,
you'll see a little bit of a difference. And we're also like, performance for me is like twofold, because bad performance is expensive Power BI models, because we are paying for that use and compute when people are using those. So this is again down to like, how do we help make like optimize performance where we can? And then also like, it does make our DAX simpler. There's less to write, and when you get used to it, like it's just kind of, it gets a little bit easier as you're going.
Well, there are some times, because I usually do Boolean logical, but a lot of times people for charting, they don't want to show true false on a chart. They want to show yes or no. It might be like, did this person fill it out? The times that they do that, I just have 2 of these columns in there because it's 2 values stored. So even if it's stored on a lot of rows, like it's a drop in the pond in terms of actual memory cost for storage. So have a hidden one that is 100% for DAX, and then have the other one. I'll sometimes append it with like visual or display or some word to indicate like this is either the one to use as a for measures or for visuals, basically. Some identifier for either of the 2 with the descriptor to say why there are 2 versions of this.
Yeah, that's definitely a way to do it. You can also write a DAX measure. You can also use a very, very tiny dimension. And then I personally, because I think it is very important for us to think through like how user-friendly is this report? What is the cognitive load as they're trying to get to the information? It also gives you the opportunity to create some more flexibility in how it's displayed without having to like transform one text value into another.
So this is a really interesting question from John. I've not actually thought about this yet. So we have dynamic formatting. Could you, I think no, but he was wondering, could you format the one to a similar to how you can format dates and you can format numbers with a measure? Is there a way to actually, like, if you had this as a 1 or 0, so you'd have that middle column, you'd only have one column, but
Mm-hmm.
on a slicer or a chart or anything else, is it change that display via the dynamic formatting to yes?
That's an interesting question. And I would probably take it a step further and say, is it an option to change true false to yes?
Yeah,
I will have to look
I'd
at
be
that. I
curious
haven't
of
really
that.
played around with
Yeah,
that yet.
because I've done some
Yeah.
fancy dynamic formatting, but it's only ever been for measures. I didn't know if you could do. I don't think there's dynamic formatting for columns though. I think it's just measures.
Yeah. I definitely will I will look at
It's
that. It's an
it's fun when
interesting
you can
idea.
get stumped. Yeah, like I had never
Yeah.
thought of that, but that is a
Yeah. I mean,
well thought
John brings
suggestion.
new good ideas to stuff all the time.
Of
Yeah.
course.
And then kind of zooming out a little bit, like I kind of have my categories of how we think about the different things that we're approaching when we get to like what is our perfect scenario model. Most of what we talked about is really about like the model size and the model schema, but definitely want to point out there are some data sources that are more efficient than other. SharePoint is really, really slow one for refreshes if you can get away from that. And then security sometimes tends to be an afterthought. People are like, well, let me just slap my real level security on at the end. But how that is going to function is going to be a big impact on what you want that model to ultimately look like if you don't want it to be much slower or potentially like not even possible implementation of your real level security requirements. Any before I jump into like requirements and wireframe stuff, any other like performance related stuff that is kind of like part of your regular tool set that I did not talk about?
The I don't think you specifically mentioned the performance analyzer, but that's the easiest one-click
Oh yeah.
option for that stuff. Just because that
Yeah.
help, I think that does help to determine is this front end or back end. When you
Yeah.
realize if you click that and all of a sudden you have a scroll bar of items on the page, there's a good chance you maybe should reduce the number of objects you have.
Yeah.
But at least you can immediately see like is the visuals waiting to load or is there a really slow DAX or anything.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
doesn't solve anything necessarily, but it helps you to know where to look.
That's true. And we definitely use that to identify some places to start. Also Tabular Editor or DAX Studio, even if you don't
Mm-hmm.
like really get into the full functionality of those tools, you can get a look at like which tables and fields are the biggest, the highest cardinality, and it shows you with like the what data types you have, and you can sort by data types. You can kind of check out and make sure like you don't have date time columns hidden in there somewhere, stuff like that. So I find that that's also a really good one to say, like, what are some of the first steps I could do to make the rest of my performance tuning like a
Exactly.
lot faster and not to spend so much time waiting for each individual piece. So I start with the biggest impact stuff first, so that as we move through the performance tuning process, gets easier and faster as we move along.
Yep.
And then jumping into requirements and where wireframe fits into this process. So I'm not going to go into like all of the details on how we do report ideation, but it does start with conversation with end users to figure out like what are we building? We want to build something valuable. We don't just want to like repeat a Power BI version of a different report that they're using. So the first thing that I want to know is what questions do the users have about the data? And I really encourage you to focus on the questions that they have and not the charts that they're looking for. And just, remind people and empower them. If you're a data visualization developer, you have more expertise around what is the best way to show this information. Um, Most of your stakeholders are not information designers. So they're going to kind of lean on what's familiar, and they might not have thought through like, is there a better way for me to get to what I actually need to do with this data? So kind of
Yep.
to follow that, we want to make sure that we understand not just the questions that they have, but like what changes in the real world when they see this information. If the answer is I'm going to report on it, I would encourage you to do a little bit of probing, because at the end of the day, like, reporting is not the point. Data informed decision making, or something that helps with like assessing what operationally needs to happen, or some kind of story that needs to be told in order to change minds about something, or you know something like that. So it's really important, I think, for data viz developers to have a good understanding of like, what is the point? Because we can get a little like blinders on at times and think that the reporting, the visualization, that's kind of the be all end all, and it's really not. That's not where we get our value from. So we want to make
Just
sure we have
one
that information. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, just and one quick mention on the whole idea that like you often are coming to a conversation with more knowledge and skill than your the end client who you're delivering this to. You know better visuals,
Yeah.
you know that how to tell a story, and I've found for years, honestly, the easiest way sometimes to convince them to use a new visual is just take the same data, copy paste visual A, like, oh, we need a line chart. Here's your
Oh,
line chart. Here's the
yeah.
scatter. Just I'm going to show you A, and then I'm going to show you B, which
Yes.
was easier to get to a number and understand the importance of that. Oh, yeah. Okay,
Absolutely.
so that just sells it. You don't even have to talk. You can just show that to them, and yep, okay, it's easier to read over here. You've convinced me.
Yeah.
I run my wheels way too much if I conceptually just try to tell them on a call without any
Yeah.
visual like no, I
Yeah.
like this chart. I've been using it for 10 years. All right, let me
Yeah.
just show you how much better your data looks in this new visual.
Exactly. And that like having that piece of like what they actually need that information for is how you're going to be able to provide
Hmm.
a really good recommendation for a better way to visualize it.
Exactly.
And then we want to make sure that we have like the human understanding of the row level security requirements. The folks that are working in the data will be the ones translating that into what do the technical requirements look like, but we want a really clear understanding of what they're anticipating from that perspective. And then because people often forget that slicers are visuals, and we need that really those relationships, the one directional filtering, the fact that we want to work well. We need to make sure that we've captured those slicer pieces. Sometimes that's another one that people tend to leave till later, and the um, model doesn't support everything that they want. And so this is not everything that we collect in report ideation, but these are the outputs that we bring into our semantic model ideation. So we've got those questions and a concept of like, what is the value and purpose of those questions? And then some of those other pieces that are going to be really helpful for us thinking through that model. And then we take those questions and we want to make sure that they've been refined. We make a lot of assumptions all the time. And so I'm going to ask you, Reed, because I've got my less concrete question. If you saw this, and I usually get like 3 different answers. If you saw this question from someone, we want you to figure out what step in this process we need to improve. Where does your brain land with what that means?
We're step in this process to so essentially, where does my brain go when I'm asking this to a client or when a client's asking
When a
this to me?
client's telling you, we need you to help us analyze what step in the process we need to improve.
I always start from the very end, and I essentially like meaning the delivered, and then I work my way backwards up the stream because it. At what point does the flow decrease, or do you notice a complexity? Do you see a redundancy? But I have a hard time knowing without actually seeing the entire picture of actually seeing your whole pipeline, so to speak, is
Mm-hmm.
where to go for that. But yeah, I usually start front to back. But I'm curious where you would approach that if you're looking for where is the the hottest fix that needs to be applied.
So yeah, slight shift on this. So this question actually came out of we need a report that helps us identify what steps in this process need improvement. And people just
Okay.
make assumptions about like what that question means. So
Mhm.
if I need an analysis on where to improve a step, the 3 answers I tend to get is which step is taking the longest, which step costs the most money, because time is not always the most money intensive piece of a process. Or when I'm talking to somebody who works with a lot of data, I'm more inclined to hear, I don't have enough information to answer that, which is a true statement. So in this scenario, if what they're looking for is we need the process to be faster and they're not focused on
Mhm.
money or some other factor, we just want to make sure that like we're not taking these statements like needs to be improved and applying different ideas on what that means, because that is what leads to what feels like requirements shifting, but it's really just like we just make a lot of assumptions all the time. So question refinement is a huge piece for us. We just want to make sure, like, as we're looking through this, if I say what step in the process takes the most time, I know like what specific kinds of fields to look
Yep.
for, like start and end for a particular step in the process.
Agreed.
And then we have those refined questions, and most of my team does hand drawn sketches of like their concept of what might go onto a Power BI report. Some people use other tools like Figma, but the intent here is not to give someone like a high fidelity prototype. The intent here is to support the mental model for the data viz developer, and also to check some assumptions that we have around what they want to see. So it'll be some like real simple line and bar charts with labeled axes, so that we know like these are the kinds of things that we're going to show to answer these questions. So it's our first opportunity for real like a real feedback loop around whether or not we have a shared understanding of what we're building. And this is not something that people spend a lot of time on. It is like a quick sketch. And then we'll go into those refined questions, and we'll create, if we do it in person, literally post-it notes on the wall. If we're doing it virtually, is Miro or Mural, to create post-it notes that are associated with every field that's needed to answer. So all of my examples in here are going to be super exciting, real world government related things instead of sales data, because I prefer to go from real examples. But one example is a team looking to do some analysis on how people are evaluated for performance. And so they're looking for like which ones are considered critical standards. So for that question, we would want to be able to identify the number of performance standards. That's a DAX measure, but we probably need to find out what field is needed for that DAX measure. And then unit name, because they want to know by unit. And then critical tag, well, that's not really what it's called. Hopefully you have a data dictionary. If you don't, make friends with a data engineer who can help you find the source of these things. But we're going to figure out what's the exact field that we're needed for these things. And then we don't want to forget those slicers, because they said they want to be able to look at it by pay plan, series, grade, and appointment type. So we'll add in stickies that apply for all of those slicers. We'll do this for every question that we have, so we know every single field that's needed to answer the things that we're trying to answer. And we also want to make sure that we're considering row level security requirements right from the very beginning. So we will also make stickies for every field that's needed in the security table, and also what's needed. Hopefully your security table is connected to one of your dimensions. Would prefer not to apply row level security directly to the fact table for performance reasons, but we want to make sure that what we're building does actually enable the row level security, so it's not an afterthought.
Well, the other thing
And
too,
then,
just as a quick
yeah,
curiosity around this, because sometimes the nice thing about an RLS table, if it's, let's just assume it's connected to your branch dimension table. That table will automatically get filtered down, which will then filter your fact table. But all your other dimension tables natively don't filter, just because there's no bidirectional and all that. So if somebody wanted to obfuscate that other data, what would you usually recommend? Meaning, like, once you filter to this branch, like I don't want any unassociated values from the other dimension tables not to show. It's not necessarily sensitive information, but it's irrelevant. Like, I don't want to filter on empty vessels.
Yeah, we absolutely do that. And we usually handle that by writing a DAX measure that we can use to filter down to only dimensions that have relevant values in the underlying source. And that has worked well for me. But if you have another approach that doesn't involve like putting RLS on everything, I'd be really curious to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially that. Like, if it actually is sensitive data, then I'd say, like, you either need to have one security table that can connect to multiple, or you need to have a couple of security tables. But otherwise, if the issue is if the data is not sensitive, I just don't want people to filter to empty values. The SQL BI pattern, int not is empty or whatever, like that just checks for like empty rows, is the fastest measure you can write for a visual level filter on slicers.
Yeah, and we don't. I don't typically see scenarios where our dimensions have sensitive data. That's typically a fact issue.
Exactly.
So the ensuring that those things are filtered following that pattern is really about like a better user experience more than it is
Yeah,
about security.
100%.
But you do raise a good point, because sometimes people apply things that are like obfuscation and not security. And that is an issue, especially if you are providing people with access to those semantic models to do their own like customized versions of your reports. And
Yep,
then
agreed.
from that, like we've got that whole list of stickies that we know we've got like every field, or we're pretty sure we have every field that we need to answer all of those questions, to apply the row level security, to enable all of the slicers. Um, the process that I follow is one that I learned from Reza Rad's article on his site about how you get to a star schema. There's a couple of there's like parts 1 and 2. He talks about like what's your approach if you're starting with one big table, what's your approach if you're starting with a more normalized snowflake type model. And I have found this to be, once you get the hang of it, to be really, really useful. So this is what we use. The one thing I think trips people up a little bit at first is like they tend to veer towards starting with defining the facts. And after you practice it a little bit, you'll find that defining those dimensions first is actually gets you where you need to go quite a bit faster, in my experience. And then, once we've got those dimensions defined, we can define our facts. Want to make sure we're flattening related hierarchies into one dimension. And then always, 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 as you move through this process, thinking through the relationships that you have in your model, and finding ways to improve them. If you've got fact tables
Hmm.
that have relations to each other, or if you've got tables with a one-to-one relationship, you can just merge those. There's not really a value. And in that one-to-one relationship, in my experience, it tends to slow things down. And you're forced into many to many at that point, which is, it's not a weak many to many scenario with the one-to-one. It's just a little bit slower.
Yeah, exactly. Like the easiest distribution that I tell people on just on speed is the longer the distance your logic has to
Yeah.
walk, like the more lines, that
Yes.
the slower it's going to be. Just imagine yourself having to walk to
Exactly.
the store. The further away the store is of your information, the longer it'll take you to get it.
Yeah, exactly. Perfectly described. So if there's a way to make that distance shorter without doing something crazy with the data, let's do that. And it also just simplifies how you think about building out those uh, models, and how you think about writing your DAX measures when those things are kind of more succinct. So we take those dimensions. Sometimes people have a hard time figuring out if something is a factor dimension. If you think about like, is this a categorical axis? Is this a slicer? Is this something that I would filter or categorize things somewhere across the board? That is probably a dimension. And as
Hmm.
much as possible, we would like our text to be in dimensions and not in the fact table. This is not always possible, especially if you have something like HR data. You may have some scenarios where like your lowest granularity is, you know, is at a person level, and there's information you have about them that is going to be in your fact table. But as much as possible, kind of moving that text out of the fact and categorizing things on the dimension side. So we take those and then we group them together when they're related. In some scenarios, this means that you are flattening like 5 or 6 tables, and because of that repetition, people feel like it's going to be slower. It's a bad thing because now I've got more data here, but that's just not how Power BI works, because that,
Yeah,
that short distance in the relationship that you're talking about is so huge for performance.
agreed.
And then just, this is totally me repeating myself, but it's also just like such a big impact. Don't make relationships between your fact tables. That's usually an indication that maybe you're missing a dimension, perhaps. And you want your dimensions to match the lowest granularity to support those one-to-many relationships. And then, as we mentioned, we do that final check to make sure we haven't created any one-to-one relationships, and that gets us to like a pretty good starting place. So that's our ideation process. We take that output, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that gets us. So we've got our proposed star schema from all of our sticky note stuff, and we've kind of checked the relationships look good. Is this as close as we can get? We've also got that report wireframe. And that star schema gives us something that is really, really valuable for us, especially if you're anyone that's working in a medallion architecture. So we use Azure Databricks. You might be using Synapse or something else. We can take that initial part where we'd like, what's our end goal? What does Power BI need to support that? And now that spreadsheet that we have of everything that we came up for that proposed star schema also tells us like, what does our platinum view need to look like in Databricks? And we can go back and say, what needs to be true in gold to support that platinum view? What things are we pushing to silver that are going to support those gold views and also make appropriate changes that might also be relevant to like data science or our APIs? And it helps us walk backwards from like, instead of taking what is our data and moving forward to how do we untangle it to make it useful, we start with the end goal, work our way backwards, and it makes it easier to give clear requirements early on to the data teams so that we don't have that like very common data availability. I guess I'm just going to crunch this all in Power BI kind of mindset. And
Agreed.
then the really beautiful thing about this, like, so this is, if you just stop here, you're in a good spot for having like a model that's going to support what you need, that's going to be more performant. But you've also given yourself something that can take you a step further in terms of how do I think about creating feedback loops earlier in my process and taking a more agile approach to Power BI report development. Because now that we've got this report wireframe and we've got this list of tables and fields, I can look at that wireframe and say, this visual needs these tables to be built. And so what we do with that is we create a logical grouping of the visuals, not based on the page, not based on how the person's going to interact with the report, but based on the underlying data needed to support it. Because typically, when you think about report development, what is an increment? It often tends to be quite large. And so what it gets you to think about it differently is, that traditional Power BI development process is quite waterfall. We don't really have a chance to get external validation until we get to publishing that like first draft of a report, which is pretty late in the game to confirm that your shared understanding is in fact a shared understanding. So what I would pose to you is that these steps of it can be done with those logical sets of data and visualization. So we can get those feedback loops earlier in the game. And this is what it looks like as a process for us. So I've got my requirements, I've grouped them together. I know that like 30% of my tables will get me this number of visuals. I'm also going to make sure that I am incorporating row level security in this first iteration, because there's this concept in the agile world of like testing your, like, it's riskiest assumption thinking. I work with a lot of like deeply knowledgeable folks on the agile coaching side, and getting to like, what's the riskiest thing? Row level security is one of your riskiest assumptions. So we're going to incorporate that in the first one. I'm going to build out from get data to publishing visuals. The first piece of my report, including row level security, I'm going to publish that up for review. My stakeholder is going to start working through feedback on that while I work on the next set of visuals. Probably some of the tables are also needed for the second set, so there might be a little bit less modeling, but I'm going to start bringing in other stuff and building out additional visuals. Then I get the feedback, incorporate it into the first ones, but also like some of that feedback is probably going to apply to the second set of visuals. So I'm going to think critically about like, how does this change some of the stuff that I was doing here? And then we just repeat the process. I typically don't see it less than 3 viz sets. Some reports may be longer than that. But what this gets us to is incorporating feedback. And then when I get to viz set 3, if I found out some stuff in viz set 1 feedback that applies to viz set 3, I don't have any rework there. So we continue to incorporate feedback as we go along. And the final feedback round is usually more than one round. However, it tends to be more at that point on like design, navigation, chart selection. There's less involved typically at that point that really is about like, let's dig into some model changes, which tend to be pretty time consuming because you've got decks to rewrite. And I would say like personal win for this process is anytime the feedback is changes how you're thinking about your bookmarks, which are
Mhm.
super annoying to make, but helpful for doing a lot of things for end users. Just having opportunities to deal with some of those like obnoxious, nitpicky things earlier and kind of shift how you're thinking about it later is incredibly, incredibly helpful. So that's
This does a good job of graphically representing as well, like even the best report developer with, a decade of experience will never deliver on the first version the correct report. Like without feedback,
yeah,
you can get something close. Like the more experience I get, the
yeah,
closer I can get off the first version to the finish line.
yeah,
I might need 2 or 3 iterations rather than 10, but I'll never get to the final iteration until I know what works and doesn't. Because you know, I thought these two pieces of data should be compared. I don't know. We actually don't care about comparing those two together. Okay, we can put them on separate pages now, or whatever
yeah,
the conversation is. But without feedback, you're just kind of blindly building something and hoping it's going to be used, and then it becomes a paperweight.
totally. And like there's so many reasons for that. And many of them are not like we think of them as changing requirements, but it's really just changing understanding of requirements. There are definitely like requirements change is a problem that we all deal with, like adapting to people kind of rethinking what they're trying to do. But like sometimes they can't really think about what they need until they start seeing it and finding like, I thought that would be valuable, but it's not. That's bringing up more questions. I kind of think the first iteration of a report should provide more questions than answers. Like if it's really um, giving new insights, people should actually have more that it's making them think about. And like the number of times, I'm sure you've experienced this too, but like the data engineering team has one understanding of a word. They're the ones helping you figure out what field to use. And like the real world scenario is totally different, or different parts of the organization have a different definition for something. And like you just can't predict how many things you might have to change just because like not enough clarity about um, what those requirements actually mean in the first place.
Agreed. Yeah, exactly.
So that is my spiel for why you should be planning your model. I actually saw earlier this week, Marco Russo had a little video on LinkedIn where he said the best time to start planning and designing your model was 12 years ago. The second best time is today. So there's some additional validation for like it seems like it's more, but like it speeds up the rest of the process so much, and those feedback loops are so important if we want to create something of value. And I also just wanted to call out before I stop screen sharing and go to questions. Power BI DC meets every month in Arlington, Virginia. We feed you. Lenore Flower, as I mentioned, is the other organizer there. John Kursky is one of our members. Next week, we have Shannon Lindsay and Stephanie Bruno are going to be joining us remotely to talk about direct lake query mode, or direct query mode with some of the new cool stuff that's come out. And we also have Alex Kolikolov, who just published a book on with O'Reilly on data visualization in Power BI, and his focus was really like proving that you can beat Tableau in terms of design and effectiveness. So very excited about that. He's going to also talk to us about his book, and I believe we'll have a giveaway. So if you're in the area locally, we'd love to have you join us.
And I just dropped a link as well in the chat directly for the DC user group.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we got some awesome people in there. It's always a good time.
Excellent. John's mentioning that the data witches for this month.
Yeah, data witches. Yep.
Yeah.
That's
I saw them
Stephanie
do
Bruno and Shannon
yeah.
Lindsay. They used to be organizers for the group and have gone off to do other things, but still lots of great content and thought leadership there.
They did a really cool power hour when I was there with them presenting at FabCon in Vegas.
Yeah, it's always fun.
No, I really like the breadth of coverage you gave for this one. It I think does a good job of covering like the easy surface level things, but also a little bit of a technical discussion on some of the whys, just things to do and to avoid, because it's always two halves of a coin. Like any best practice is going to come with a bad practice you should avoid. Any bad practice to avoid usually comes with also a best practice to apply otherwise. So
yeah,
it just depends on which approach you're coming from on going through that discussion. But this was really good, and I have very active chat today as well. A couple of questions that I queued up that were not directly related to anything we went over, but is good for Q&A
That's all good.
section here. So let me bring this up. Here we go. So if Guillermo is still on, one of the questions from him. So they're facing an implementation of slow changing dimensions from a Power BI perspective of importing, towards like a star schema. What would your approach be of needing to ingest and then model a slow changing dimension?
I will pass that question to you because it's not really something that I've been dealing with personally.
Yeah, and if I remember off the top of my head, a slow changing dimension should be ones that, well, it also depends on if it's type 1 or type 2, but I'm going to assume for the thought of this without further detail that this is something that records changes every time it actually does. So like you have history built into theirs. So ideally there is an is latest flag that's already in the database. It makes things super simple. Otherwise, the things that I've done is with Power Query, the easiest way to keep it folding is you have a source query, reference it twice. One of them, you basically do a group by up to the latest date, and then you join it back to the main one via left join, and that will maintain folding, but you can essentially do a two-part join, like ID and date, and basically pre-filter the first one with all the original details to that. You can technically do a group by with all rows and expand back out, but the problem with that, like, that combo package is sadly that does not fold. I really wish that would because it's the simpler of the two, but it does break query folding. So if that table is used anywhere downstream in your queries, things slow down. So I prefer usually the latest, a summarized latest date table, just ID and current date, and then the other full detail, and just do a left join and filter or inner join. One of the two to get to that distinct thing for a dimension.
Yeah. Our data does not support that, so haven't really dug into it much.
Yeah, no worries. And then one other one, let's see, and I'll read this out loud as well. How to manage times change in the ID from a fact to a changing dimension where the characteristics are changing in present. I don't actually know if I understand this one. So, Guillermo, if you have a follow-up, feel free to drop that in. But yeah, I don't think I have enough context on what you need on this question specifically. So I'll circle back to that if he comes up with it. But otherwise, I have one left from John. Any advice for... Great one. You always mind end of the stream question anyways. What any advice for Power BI users getting into GCC work?
Patience, persistence. Yeah, and I think like not everyone has like a really clear picture of what that means getting into that. So first of all, if you're not familiar with GCC, Microsoft has 3 government clouds. So we've got the commercial cloud, but then there's GCC, which is the government community cloud. And then there's GCC High and DoD. And GCC is like the trickiest of all. My understanding is because the way that it was developed was like a mix of commercial and federal approach to building it out. Kursky might have a better way of defining that, but we are often the last to get things. We don't often get any kind of announcements associated with it. Sometimes things just show up. And so there, it's a different world when it comes to what's available, when it will be available, if we have any kind of timeline around it. And basically what I've heard is that it's because like the way that they're building it, they're kind of working backwards from DoD once they get things worked out on the commercial side. So there are limitations on the GCC side. So like getting familiar with what those limitations are. I would also say like certainly in the DC area, but I know in other places as well, like getting involved with user groups can be really helpful because there are other people who are solving problems in that same space, and the documentation is perhaps not as good when it comes to what is or is not available and how to approach certain things in that scenario. But there are a lot of people doing it, and kind of working through like how they approach some of those inherent challenges on the GCC side.
Thank you for the detailed response on that one, and thanks, John, for the question as well. I think that was it for the questions. A big shout out and thank you from Donald as well. And oh, interesting. So some of these I don't know. So a shout out at least to a couple of female star schema modelers, Margie Ross, Laura Reeves, and Laura Reeves I've heard of. I don't know Joy Mundy. Are you familiar with the other two?
I am not familiar with those names, no.
Names that I will Google later.
Yeah. Thanks for
Oh,
the shout
part
out.
of the Kimball group. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah.
But Leslie, this has been fantastic. I appreciate you coming on and sharing this. And this is definitely a stream link that I will be using to send to a few people. Like, hey, do you have any like live streams that are really good on like some modeling 101s and other considerations on the the star schema design? This would be a good reference for that. So thank you for the quality content and sharing this out with the community.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's fun chatting about this.
Absolutely. And I'd love to have you back on some point in the future as well. But otherwise, I'll wish you and everybody else a great weekend and hope to get you back on sometime.
Yep, sounds great. Awesome. Thanks, Reed.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you want to help support this channel, take a look at our channel memberships or our merchandise store for cool swag. And last but not least, please consider sharing this video on your social media platform of choice to help our channel grow. So, until next time.